Hello, I'm Jason Weaver, the Assistant Principal at East Middle School for Joplin Schools. We wanted to take some time to share with all of our parents and community members some of the things that are happening in Joplin schools with regards to the grading system. We've had a series of parent meetings, but recognize that sometimes it's tough for everybody to make it to those, and we want to make sure everyone gets the same information. So today I'm sharing with you some of the presentations from those parent nights because we want to make sure that people understand the concept of our standards-based grading and some of the things behind it. The purpose of the presentation that we've put together and that we've been sharing is twofold. One of them is to make parents aware of how grades function under a new system that Joplin is piloting this year, and also to take people through the thought process that we've been going through as educators when we looked at the grading and assessment systems that we've been using and really tried to hold them up to the goals that we have for why we do what we do in school. The ultimate goal, of course, is that we want students to learn, and we want to make sure that everything that we do, every moment of the day when kids are with us, is setting kids up in the best possible environment to do that. So as we kind of work through this, I'm going to take nothing for granted. There may be some things that you've already heard, but I want to walk everything through step by step and sort of show the thinking process that's gone on into this, as well as get into some of the nuts and bolts of what's going on with a standards-based grading environment and address some of the concerns that sometimes come up and how we're working to address those concerns. The pilot program that has begun has been taking place so far at two of our elementary schools, McKinley Elementary and Kelsey Norman Elementary, and at East Middle School for the middle school level. It's a pilot study, which means that we're doing some experimenting. We've done a lot of research in the past couple of years and had several teachers that have been examining how to take what we've learned about good practice and put it into place in our schools. So I want to share with you some of the work that those teachers have been doing today. All of it comes back down to a single concept that we have, that grades are a part of the learning process for students. And when we start thinking about that, it's taken us on quite a journey. We start by taking a look at standards-based grading and the system of standards-based grading and ask ourselves, what's the point? Why do we even have grades? We've all had grades. Every one of us has gone through school and been given a report card of some kind or another, so we're familiar with it. But why do we do that, other than the fact that we've just always done it? The common thing that all of us can agree on is that grades serve the purpose of making sure that everyone, parents, teachers, and students, know what learning is taking place. They're meant to be an accurate reflection of student learning. And when we all can agree on that, we as educators have started to question, do the current letter grades that we've been using really help us meet that goal to the best of our ability? Now, we're not saying that letter grades and everything that we've been doing so far is all bad. There's some benefit to the letter grades that we've been using. One of those benefits is that it gives us a common language. Everybody has gotten a grade card with some A's, B's, C's, and D's on it and know what those letters mean. They represent something. What we've started to ask ourselves is, do we really know what those letters mean when they come across, and do they tell us everything we need to know? They also give us a quick snapshot of progress. On one half sheet of paper, you can see every class that your child is taking and what letter grade they've earned in that to give you a quick glimpse at how they're doing overall in school. And sometimes that quick snapshot's very important. What we've noticed, though, is that there are some limitations to those grades. One of them being that when you're taking just a quick snapshot, snapshots can only tell you so much. There's a lot of other information that needs to go along with it. It makes it tough to diagnose the problems that we see. If your child brought home a D or an F, obviously we'd be concerned about that, but what caused the D or F isn't something that we can tell from the grade card. We need more information to be able to act on it. We also have begun discovering that there's a lot of ways that our grades can be distorted, and that's because when we try and balance everything, average everything that goes on in a classroom and distill it down to one single letter, there are a lot of things that influence where that letter happens to fall. And if we're trying to, again, tell what a student's doing in class and where their learning strengths and weaknesses are, that one letter isn't always sufficient to the task. We find that those letter grades, when we're honest with ourselves, are much more subjective than we as educators really would like them to be. And part of that is because so many factors go in, again, to determining a letter grade that it's easy for things to pull one portion or another of a student's performance out of proportion when we report a single letter grade. And most importantly, what we find from a great deal of research that's been done on the subject is that letters and single grades on tasks or on classes take the learning focus away and make conversations more about evaluating and judging and less about the learning process, which is not where we want kids to spend their time. So, to illustrate some of the kinds of things that we've discovered when we take a look at our grades, I want to share with you some examples. So let's imagine for a moment. It's a realistic kind of scenario. We'll say that all students in the 7th grade are required to take a personal finance course for 1 quarter. Now the single objective of this personal finance course is going to be that they know how to balance a checkbook at the end of the class. Now, that's a valuable real-world skill we'd hope all of our students would master. So if we use that example, let's take a look at some of the things that might happen in this classroom. Most of these assignments, projects and things are probably pretty common kinds of assignments that we'd expect to see. So taking a look at them, we see some of the things that students are going to be graded on in this class are assignments about, there's one about the history of banking, one of those read the passage, answer some questions kinds of things. There's a vocabulary assignment about banking terms. There's a section of math problems where students work sample math problems from a checkbook to see if they can balance it. Other than those assignments, there's also a project, a My Checkbook project. And the way this project is set up is that each week students are going to be given a fake paycheck, and with that paycheck, a set of fake bills. The goal's simple. They try and balance their checkbook week by week, just like we would expect to do in the real world. Now there's of course a test, because how can you tell if someone's learning if we don't give a test, right? So we give them a test that includes questions from all of the history and the vocabulary, some math problems and things that we've done. Everything from the unit will be on this test somehow or another. Now here's a common thing that we see in a lot of classroom grading systems, the class notebook. This is where kids are supposed to be learning organization skills. So we keep track of all the notes and all of the assignments and all of the things that you've done in class. You put them in a notebook, keep them in order, and that is graded at the end. So there's a 10-point notebook assignment here. And there's even an opportunity to get some extra credit in this class. It looks like if you'll do some research on your own, find a news article that has something to do with personal finance and banking, write a summary of it and turn it in, you could earn some extra credit points. So the math on this works out pretty nicely. There's 100 points possible in this particular unit with 10 points of extra credit. So now, with these assignments, let's take a look inside the gradebook of one of the teachers of this class. Just to kind of familiarize ourselves with what we're looking at, we can see the names of the assignments listed here and their point values, and across the top are the names of some of our students. One of the things that stands out right away is the grade that each of these students received. They all got C's, and not just a C, they all made a perfect 70%. Things came out exactly the same. Now, that's a common and possible situation, but when you look a little closer at each of the students, there's very different reasons for why the students ended up with that C. Let's take Sam, for example. In Sam's case, we can see he's done several of his homework assignments. There's one of them, though, the checkbook math problems, he got a 0 on. And I also noticed that he got a 0 on the checkbook project, where he was supposed to be able to keep and balance a checkbook. Now, he did okay on the tests. He did okay on the vocabulary and the history. He can read and answer questions well. He did the notebook. He's organized, it seems. And he even did some extra credit. Yay for him. He earned a 70 points out of the 100, so 70% and a C. The question is, if the goal of our class is that Sam knows how to balance a checkbook, does Sam really know what we want him to learn from this? James is another case. James earned a C as well here, but when we take a look at what James's assignments look like, there's a problem there right off the bat. James hasn't turned in any of his homework assignments. They're all missing. Now, it does look like he did pretty well on his project. He got all the points there. A perfect project when it came to balancing his checkbook. We probably did that in class, so that was easy. He also did really well on the test. Must pay attention in class good. Nothing in his notebook, so again, maybe not so organized. And he didn't try the extra credit. He did pull enough between the projects and the test, though, that he was able to earn 70%. So he also got a C. Does he know what he's supposed to? Probably so. It seems that he knows how to balance a checkbook. He's proven that here, but are there some concerns we have about James as a student? Absolutely. They're just different from the kinds of concerns we have about Sam. Mariah is another interesting case. Mariah, if we watch the numbers as we go through, the first assignments, Mariah didn't do so hot. Her project was a little better. By the time the unit is over and she gets to the test, she's doing pretty well. Seems like it was just one of those things that it took a while for it to sink in with Mariah. She tried, she's attempted everything. When it finally started making sense, she was able to perform very high. But we average all of these scores together when we try and determine what letter grade to give Mariah. So despite the fact that at the end she was able to show us that she understands what we wanted her to learn, we're going to hold her accountable for all these times before when she didn't understand. And we're going to tell you that Mariah only knows this at a 70% level. Now Tara has started off much better. She's done great on every assignment, every project. Her notebook was all in order. Now this, though, may be a familiar case for some of us. If you're one of those kinds of people that freeze up when you have to take a test, then you might be able to relate to Tara, because that's kind of what her problem is here. She's unable to do well on this test, and there's a lot of reasons that that happens for students, test anxiety and other cases. But when we average all of those things together again, despite the fact that Tara has been able to perform over and over and over and over again, demonstrate to us that she knows what she's doing, one test that she didn't do so hot on is going to pull her down to a C as well. So when we look at all four of these students, we would say under our traditional grading system that each of them deserves a C. The question is, if our goal in giving grades is to make sure that students are giving an accurate reflection of their learning, does this letter grade do that? Can we honestly say that all four of these kids understand how to balance their checkbook at the same level? Because that's what our numbers game has done for us under a traditional grading system. Now, these are just some of the things that started making educators in Joplin, and we're not the only ones, but started our process here in Joplin thinking that maybe there's something flawed with the way that we calculate grades and the way we track assessments of how students learn. It's what prompted many of us in several of these schools to begin investigating some other approaches. There's a significant amount of research and lots of other schools that have tried a system based on standards reporting. The standards-based grading approach is one where we report students' learning based on their level of understanding for each of the major objectives or standards in a course. So what that means is, instead of telling you that one letter grade for how your student did in math or economics or science, we'll break down each of the different skills or categories that a student should be able to learn by the time they're done in their math class and tell you how well they did at each of those skills. It's a much more specific picture than before, and it reports a little differently. The process that we go through when we talk about a standards-based grading approach begins with the classroom teachers and our curriculum development teams by identifying the standards for each course. When we take a look at all of the things that teachers are expected to teach in our classrooms, what we find are that the standards that are given to us from the state and national levels and from local groups and all of the other factors that have something to say about what do we teach in our classrooms, if we piled them all up together and said that we're only going to teach each skill maximum of 1 week, it would take more than the 12 years of school that we have kids. It'd take up to 23 or 24 years of school just to get through everything, and that's assuming everybody gets it the first time. So the reality is that there's more expected of us than we can actually teach and teach well. And since we're concerned about student learning, as educators, we make professional decisions about where should we focus the most of our time and energy. This process, which standards-based grading kind of gears us toward, has nothing to do with just about grades. It's a good educational move for us to consider what's most important for students to learn, and are we focusing on that? So we spend some time identifying the most essential skills that students need, not just in our classrooms or in the next school year, but to make it in life. And we take those essential standards and then begin looking for evidence. We sort of play the role of a CSI. We try and find the evidence that tells us how well does each student know or understand each of the concepts that we're talking about. And when we gather evidence, like any good investigator, we want as much evidence as we can to support whether or not we can say a student knows or does not know something. So we take, when we say evidence, we take all the things that we would have before and look at them again. Assignments, tests, projects, quizzes. The more things that we can look for, the better picture we're going to have. We gather all that evidence, look at each one to say, does this piece of evidence, does this assignment, does this test question show us the student understands the concept or not? After we've gathered several pieces of evidence, we summarize that together for each standard and try and say, how well does all of the evidence show that this student understands the concept that we've been measuring? Now, the scales that we use are one of the things that we're developing as we try and find a way to report out. You'll notice that we've gotten away from a traditional single-letter grade and tried to choose some words, some language that better explains what the level of a student's understanding is. So when we take a look at all of the evidence for a student and how they've performed on a given standard, we might report that a student has met their expectation. They know the material. They're able to prove to us over and over and over again that they understand what they're talking about, and we're able to say with quite a bit of certainty that this student has mastered the objective. That's what we want to be able to say for every student about every one of the essential standards that we identify. Now, we also recognize that not everybody learns at the same rate. And sometimes, in the time that we have to teach a unit, not everybody's going to get there. If you ever had to come back and practice fractions in math class, or decimals, or if it was the next year in science before some of those chemistry equations made sense to you, then you can relate to the fact that sometimes we'll see progress, but not enough that we can say a student really knows it. That's where the emerging level comes in. We describe a student who is making progress, but hasn't been able to consistently show us time and again that they understand what we're talking about. Not met would be the clear indicator that all the evidence that we have shows this student really doesn't understand it. And there's nothing wrong with that. We need to know if there's a gap in a student's understanding. But when we report that a student hasn't met the objective, what we're saying is there's a lot of evidence out there that there are some major problems in the understanding. And this is one of the areas we need to really focus on with this student. We may choose to report that there is no evidence. This is a difference in the systems that we would have used before. In the past, if a student didn't turn in an assignment, we'd say that's a 0. It's an F. And we would attempt to tell you how much your child knew about fractions in math based on nothing. Under the standards-based grading system, we were forced to start thinking about that practice a little differently and realize that if we're saying that if we assign a value to a student that turns in nothing, we're making up a score that is really no reflection at all of what a student understands. So we instead more honestly report that there is no evidence. We can't tell you how we think your student is doing because there's not enough information for us to make a good decision about that. And rather than try and make something up just to satisfy the need to have a grade, we're going to be honest with the fact that we don't know. And that also is a problem that we need to pay attention to, finding ways to get evidence from that student. Now, it's also possible that students on the other end of the spectrum are able to meet their objectives very quickly and are ready to go on. In a lot of traditional grading systems, we're sort of guided by the mentality that in 7th grade you learn certain things, in 8th grade you learn certain things, and once you're done with that, you're ready to go on to the next grade, but that doesn't happen until the next school year. When we start looking at the way grades work and we start thinking more about not assigning a number to a kid, but measuring how well do they understand, we reach the point where we can start saying there are some kids who understand this skill that is required of them in the 7th grade at a level that's far beyond what we expect of a 7th grader. And so we can report that as well. At the middle school, we call that an exceeding level, and we can designate for students who go above and beyond and are able to prove not just that they understand the material consistently, but they can do things with it that peers aren't able to or are expected to, and that students at a higher level are expected. So we get the chance to recognize and much more accurately track where students' progress really falls. So when we take a look at all of these standards-based grading concepts and how the system comes together, we also take a look at the impact that this shift in the way we report and track and report progress has on students in the classroom. And there are several impacts that we see both from our experience as teachers who've been implementing this system and playing around with pieces of it for the last couple of years, and from schools around the country and around the world who've been using this system for well over 20 years. It's not new information. We're following the bandwagon of folks that have already pioneered and figured out that, hey, there is a better way. Some of the impacts that we see, first off, are that the information that we're starting to gather is much more accurate. When we start looking at information about grades that report learning only and start taking away some of the things that muddy up our grades, we get a better picture. What I mean by that is, if you've ever been given an assignment and turned it in a day late and had the teacher take 20% off for that, well, we might have said that we were teaching you responsibility. But the truth of the matter is, we just lied to you about how much you know. When you can prove to us that you can do everything we ask of you, and we take 20% off because you didn't meet our deadline, whether it's because you're not organized and needed a reminder or two, or because it just took you a little longer to figure it out, we've lied about how much you actually know because we've decided that there's a certain time that you had to learn it by. In the real world, it doesn't work like that. In the real world, if you don't pass your driver's test the first time, you get to go back and learn again. And there's no penalty the next time that you take it because it's their second time taking it. Learning takes place at a different rate for every person. When we start muddying up information in a single grade by throwing in things like late work and extra credit and other things that don't have anything to do with the standards we're measuring, we start messing with the report. We get more accurate information when we keep behaviors, things like are you organized, are you on time, are you prepared, separate from the things that you do that demonstrate your learning and understanding. The assessment information that we gather is more accurate, which means that we're able to make better decisions. As we make decisions based on data about student learning, when we can see the difference between when a student has a learning gap and when a student has a behavioral issue, we can do a better job responding to the student's needs in a more timely manner. A C, as we saw earlier in the example, could mean lots of things. And to just know that a student made a C when they came to you and then try and figure out, well, where is this student weak? It takes much longer than if you know this student has exemplary academic performance but not so hot on the work habits. That gives us better information so that we can make decisions when we're saying this student needs this kind of help. It also helps us when we say that a student's not doing so great in math class, we can identify which skill is it that the student is not doing well on and spend our time and energy on that, as opposed to just trying to reteach everything in math and hope for the best. It gives us better information so that we're making better decisions. It helps also, we see, improve a student's understanding. One of the most important pieces of research that we've been basing some of this on are the studies of John Hattie, who shows that the most significant thing that a teacher can do to improve student learning out of all the research done in educational strategies is provide specific feedback. The more specific the feedback a student receives, the greater the impact on their learning because they know where their specific strengths and weaknesses lie. A traditional letter grade doesn't provide that kind of feedback. In a standards-based grading system, first off, everything has a clear meaning. We think we know what a B means. We think we know what an A means. But in some classes, an A is what everybody's expected to have. Where in other classes, if you read the description, an A is exemplary performance, and we'd say B is the expectation. There's some inconsistency there, even within that same system. We're trying to clarify marks have meanings. So students can see where am I strong, where am I weak, and take more ownership over it. When those grades become measures of progress instead of something that they feel a teacher is doing to them, then students are able to take more ownership over it and respond accordingly. And that's what we see then in terms of the motivation. Students start to feel more motivated to do something about their grades because they're able to see where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and understand what we're doing when we try and measure learning. The opportunity for hope is there. One of the examples that has challenged a lot of us is to consider what happens when a student is given a 0. If we assign a 0, especially if we assign a 0 because a student didn't turn in one piece of work, and then we go on to the entire quarter's grades and look at all of the other times where a student has maybe made perfect 100% on all of their grades, we average all of those numbers together. That 0 has a tremendous impact pulling the average of all the other numbers down. And when you see very many zeros, statistically, to be able to pull that back up so that your average is an A takes a lot more work. And that gives a very quick defeated mentality. Another way to consider that is if you give a kid an F and you label them as a failure, which is what that F represents, whether we intend it to be that way or not, that's how it's taken. It's very difficult once you're labeled a failure, especially if you believe that about yourself, then you're not as motivated to do something about it. A standards-based grading approach takes away some of that stigma and also gives you a more accurate reflection where you can see there are areas where I am strong and areas where I am weak. And to improve, I don't have to do everything. I can focus on one or two things and see an immediate impact. That's hope. And that's what motivates students. They see the impact of their effort, and it helps move them from a fixed mindset that says, I'm as smart as I'm ever going to be, I'm just not good at math, and moves them into a growth mindset where they can see, I'm not good at some things in math yet, but if I keep working, I'll be able to improve over time. The increase in student motivation ultimately leads us to greater achievement. And the greater achievement is because of that feedback that we give. When students know what they're doing well and what they're not doing well and can see at a more specific level than just the entire course overall, they're able to do more to improve themselves. And that pays off for us in all of the other ways that we measure assessment or achievement. So taking a look at the impacts of standards-based grading makes it sound like a logical step for a lot of educators, but there are still several concerns that honestly teachers and parents and some students have expressed as well. And recognizing that, some of us who have been playing around with the system of standards-based grading have been thinking about how do we address some of these concerns. So I want to share with you some of the fears that are common to a move to a standards-based grading system, as well as some of the facts behind how those systems really work. So one of the first common fears is, whoa, this is too much information, a little information overload. When you're used to seeing a single grade card with one letter for each subject, and you suddenly get one page for each class with the list of standards and the level that students have reached each one, that can be a little overwhelming. But the fact of the matter is, first off, it's not really as new as we imagine. If anybody can remember their kindergarten grade cards when you got no letters, but instead saw a list of categories like plays well with others, can count to 10, can say their ABCs, can identify shapes and colors, and saw whether each one was marked with a check or a plus or a minus, then you've already experienced a standards-based grading environment. Each skill is marked separately, and you see no summary, no average of them all. It's just each skill and how did I do with each one of those. So what we're really doing is taking what's already been in place in K1 and 2 and just moving it up through the upper elementary and into the secondary level as well, giving the same kind of specific information that we gave at the lower levels to all students so that they have the benefit of using that information to improve. Another thing that we sometimes consider have gotten hung up on is the fact that we're all used to A, B, C, D, F. That's just been the common language. Some of you might remember, though, getting an E, an I, an S, or some other letters because it turns out A, B, C, D, F hasn't been around all that long either. There have been lots of systems of grading that schools have used and are using. It's not true that every school in the country or even the world all uses the same ABCDF system. It's maybe what we're used to, but it's not the only way out there. And once we have time to become familiar with it, any system can be one that we all understand and become our common language. And the truth of the matter is, we see those grades and know that something is wrong in some cases. And that's all well and good, but if we really want to do something about it, if you don't like the grades that you see on the grade card at the end of the quarter, you call the teacher the next day and ask, hey, what's going on with my student? Now, we're giving the information that people ask for anyway to you up front. We're sharing the same level of reporting about how students are doing right away without trying to hide behind a single letter grade. Another fear that sometimes comes up when we talk about taking away letter grades is the fact that we no longer have GPAs for college and scholarships. Well, the truth of the matter there, the fact is, there's more to it than needing letters to figure a GPA. We've talked to some universities and admissions offices to see what really is the college take on it. And one of the things that we find is that colleges are more accustomed to dealing with a variety of GPAs than we might imagine. There are schools who use a 4-point scale, a 5-point scale, a weighted scale, and like I mentioned earlier, there are some schools that for several years now haven't been reporting letter grades at all. So it's not uncommon for colleges to see GPAs figured in lots of different ways. One GPA isn't necessarily the same as a GPA from somewhere else, and colleges know that. So it's not as important to them as, say, something like an ACT score or other factors that colleges look at. GPA isn't the only thing that they examine. There are many schools who've adopted the standards-based grading model and have successfully implemented it now for several years. Those students are still able to get scholarships and go to college, and we see that other people are doing the same thing that we're doing, and it's still working for them. We know that colleges are interested in other kinds of indicators and that there are other ways to gauge the readiness of a student for college and for scholarships. And despite all of the evidence here that perhaps GPA isn't something that we worry about as much as that we should worry about as much as we are, there's nothing that says we can't still calculate a GPA score based in a standards-based grading environment. It doesn't work quite the same way as just averaging A, B, C, D, and F together, assigning each one a point, but we can do the same kind of thing, assigning points to different levels. And in cases where we need to report a GPA, there are ways that teachers are working on now that we could still calculate and report such a score. Another concern that comes with lack of a GPA or lack of letter grade is that we won't be able, for our own purposes, to calculate honor rolls or eligibility for sports and such things that we do. And a lot of times those are based on GPAs and averages of letter grades. But there's still a way to address both of those concerns in the new standards-based grading system that's really very similar to the way we would have done it before. For example, in the honor roll system, right now, we would say an honor roll student is someone that makes all A's and all B's. And on every grading scale, an A is 90 to 100%. B's are 80 to 89%. In the case of our new standards-based grading system, we can match the same level of proficiency by saying that students have to make mastery on 80% or more of their learning goals for all of their classes. That would be the same thing as earning an A or a B under the old system. But we get to add an extra piece to that honor roll students, we say, not only should be able to academically perform, but should also exhibit certain work habits and characteristics that make them good students. And so when we categorize those things separately, those work habits, and they get their own rating as well, we can also say that honor roll students have to have reached a satisfactory level on their work habits, like on time for class, prepared, hard worker, effort, those kinds of things. Now the same is true of athletics, but on the other end of the scale. The way state guidelines govern who's eligible to participate at the secondary level in sports are to say that students can only fail no more than one class. Well, we would say a failure is an F. And on most grading scales, again, an F is 60% or below. We can use the same level of specificity to say that in any class where a student fails to meet at least 60% of their standards, then they are failing that class. And that failure would make them ineligible for sports if that's the case for more than one class. So it's possible for us to calculate those same kinds of things in a standards-based grading environment in exactly the same kind of way that we would, holding to the same standard that we would under the traditional letter grade system that we're all used to. So without that being a fear, again, the other one that comes into play is about what we're teaching students with our grades. Common fear is that if we stop doing things like penalize students for turning in their work late or give them zeros if they don't turn it in, that we're not teaching students to be responsibility, that they won't have anything to motivate them. What we find is that that's absolutely not true, and that it's also very, very bad practice as educators when we compare that to the research that's out there. The truth of the matter is, we do worry about those kinds of behaviors. We just don't think that penalizing students for being late or not turning their work in and penalizing their grade is the way to change the behavior. What it actually does is it turns us as teachers into liars. We report to a parent and a student that they only understand 60 or 70% of the material. The truth is they understand 100% of the material. Their problem is they're not able to get their work done on time or they're not organized. And we put that into the same letter grade or the same grade for an assignment as their performance on the learning. And we turn what we report as a grade into a lie. It's not a measure of what their learning is anymore. It's a measure of whether or not they can meet deadlines in learning, and it's hard to tell the difference between the two. We do think that students need to be held responsible for it, and there are ways for us to monitor that, different kinds of consequences we can use to help modify the behavior. Grades are based on points and percentages, and that can set kids back, as we talked about before, because it takes away the hope that students can have if they make some of those mistakes, because mathematically, when we play the numbers game with standards or with points, a zero can be devastating. It's very difficult to come back from a zero and bring your average up. And if that mistake was an honest one, we hurt good kids who could be working at a much higher level, and we distort that because of that zero. And for students who have lots of concerns with work habits, we make it near impossible for them to ever show improvement because of that flawed system. Let's take a look, go back and take a look at the students from our personal finance class and see what would be different in a standards-based grading classroom. One of the first things here when we take a peek into the teacher's grade book for this particular class is that we see, well, one huge difference is that there are a lot of assignments from the first grade book that aren't showing up here. The reason for that is, and this is one of the layers of subjectivity that we cut out in a standards-based grading environment, a lot of the assignments that we were giving had nothing to do with whether or not students could meet our learning goal. The learning goal was that students could balance a checkbook. Do they need to know about the history of banking, like one of those assignments asked them to? Maybe it's interesting if you're a history person, but it has nothing to do with your ability to balance a checkbook. So it's not valid evidence, and we can't grade and report on that if we're going to really stick to, can kids meet our goal of balancing a checkbook? Same with the vocabulary of banking terms. Maybe it's important to know, but it by itself doesn't prove to us whether or not a student knows how to balance their checkbook, so we can't count it. It's not valid evidence. Out of all those things that we were doing, there are only a few that actually do give us accurate evidence. One of them would be the assignment about checkbook math problems. Could students work a few sample problems on a homework assignment? That would give us some indication of whether or not they know how to balance a checkbook. Of course, the project, My Checkbook, where you were given a fake paycheck and fake bills and tried to balance it, that would be a huge piece of evidence if students could do well that would prove they know how to balance their checkbook and meet our goal. And you know, the test isn't a bad thing, but when all of the questions in the test are about things like history and vocabulary and things not about balancing a checkbook, we may have to cut down to just a couple of the questions to actually tell if students can master our concept or not. So only a few of those questions are valid evidence. So now we take a look at how each of these students did. Sam was, remember all of these guys earned C's the first time, and Sam earned a C because he was able to turn his notebook in on time. He did some extra credit, but when it came down to it, the things that measure whether or not Sam knows how to balance a checkbook every single time proved he has no idea how to do it. Now, maybe he knows how to play the game where he can read and look up the answers back in the reading. So he did okay on that kind of a homework assignment. And if he knows how to use a dictionary, he could do okay on the vocabulary assignments. He can keep any paper that we give him in a folder and turn that in as his class notebook, but none of those things prove to us that he can balance a checkbook, so none of those things can be measured. We say overall that when it comes to balancing a checkbook, Sam has not met that objective. However, we can say about Sam, He is prepared for class, he gives good effort, and he's very organized. Those are positive work skills that are putting him in the right path. But what we see with Sam is there's some sort of a learning difficulty here. We need to address that. In James' case, James, we saw, didn't do so great, if you remember, turning in homework assignments. So when we grade the math problems, there's no evidence to support whether or not he can balance a checkbook because he didn't turn it in. We're not going to give him a 0 and average that together because that turns his grade into a lie. We're just going to say, honestly, we have no idea. There's no evidence here. But when we see the project that he did in class and when he gives us the test, he's able to show us every time that he can meet our expectation. He can balance a checkbook. And so we're going to say that most of the evidence supports he can meet our expectation. He has mastered this standard. Now, we are also going to say there are some things that concern us. Because he's not prepared for class and his organizational skills weren't so great, we're going to report those as minuses or unsatisfactories and say there are some behavior problems that James needs to address, and we're going to correct those. We're going to pay attention to them. In fact, we're more likely to pay attention to it now because we can see the score isn't a score of a 0 or a 50% because he turned it in late or because he didn't do his work or understand his work well. It's because nothing was there. We're able to track that separately. We pay more attention to it, and we're going to work with James on some work habits. In Mariah's case, we see the same pattern again. We see that Mariah did not meet her expectation the first time. She started doing a little better with the project. Things started making sense, and by the end of the unit, Mariah finally got it. And we're willing to say that, but we also know that there hasn't quite been enough evidence to prove that Mariah can do it over and over and over and over again, which is the goal of mastering an objective. We'll say instead that she is emerging, that she's getting close to the point where she can master that goal, but we need a little bit more time to see that. Now, we'll also look at her work habits and say that she's prepared for class, she's organized, and she gives amazing effort. So she has several things working to her advantage that are going to make it possible for her to meet that expectation. And in a standards-based environment, we're more likely to give her time next quarter to give us more evidence. And when she's able to give us more evidence, we'll come back and honestly report to her and her parents that Mariah has met this standard. We're worried now about can students actually meet the objective and learn, not can they meet the objective and learn on our timetable. Tara's problem was that she was not a great test taker, and we still see that. We see that she's able to do it when it comes to homework and her projects. She can balance a checkbook, which was our goal again. But tests, she's a little shaky, so the evidence doesn't quite show that she knows what she's doing. But when we look at the pattern of evidence again, every time we see her, we see that she's able to do it, except for this one time, which as a teacher is going to make me think maybe there's something up with this, not something about Tara that means she doesn't understand. So I'm going to go ahead and report that she has met expectations. And she has good work habits, so I know she's trying her best and she's turning things in on time. She's set up in a good environment to do her best. The problem most likely lies with the way I tried to assess her. And that's true of a lot of our students. Tests work for some, not for others. Big projects that carry the entire weight of a class for a quarter or a term may be something that a few kids can do well on. But if you're not one of those kids, you're sunk. And we don't want those kinds of things to bring a grade down. So we're willing to recognize that maybe this is not a good assessment type for Tara. We look at all the other evidence that we can collect, we weigh it equally, and then we make our decision about what Tara knows. When we take a look at what a standards-based grading system does and the way that it asks us to report grades and to monitor progress of students, it really forces us to look again at the purpose of giving our grades. It brings us back into alignment with what, as educators, we want to be able to say that our grades are for learning. They help students see where they're strong. They help students identify where they need to spend their time and energy if they want to improve, and they give everyone, parents, students, and teachers, the accurate, up-to-date information they need in order to be able to make the decisions to move students forward to the best of their ability. We recognize that there's a learning curve that goes with a change as drastic as leaving a traditional grading system and moving to a standards-based reporting system. Lots of things look different, and some of the conversations we have really challenged us as educators to think about the way we do things. We're going through the same learning process that we'd ask our students to. And we think that's valuable. We're committed to making sure that we do our best for students and not accepting that we're going to do things just because that's the way it's always been done. That doesn't necessarily make it right. And when we see that we can do something better than we have before, we believe, because we hold ourselves to such high standards, that it's malpractice for us not to do the right thing for students. And there is no denying that the research and the experience of our educators shows that this is the right thing for students. That's why we're experimenting with it. That's why we're challenging ourselves and our ideas. And that's why we want to move forward. Now, I'm sure that there's no way every question can be answered in a single presentation, so we want to close by encouraging anyone that has more questions to visit with your student's teacher and principal, the school officials. We're very excited about what we're doing. We're learning, and we have changes to make as we go. We welcome the feedback, and we're excited to get to share what we're going through, what we're learning with you, because our commitment stays the same. We want to make sure you, as parents and students, know how you're doing and can really see what learning is taking place. That commitment will never change, and we're willing to put the time and energy into making sure that we do that well. I'm Jason Weaver from Joplin Schools. Thank you for your time.